So, a little bit about me. About 10 years ago, I learned about an opportunity to volunteer for the Department of Natural Resources and was trained along with others to teach classes on the Chesapeake Bay watershed to elementary and middle school students. Um, uh, I learned to teach, one of the things I learned to teach about was horseshoe crabs. And that's a picture of me tagging them during spawning season in Ocean City. Other classes included taking fourth graders to streams and identifying macroinvertebrates to determine the health of streams. And we were also invited to in-service training classes where I learned about climate change. That piqued my interest. And after researching climate change on my own for about a year, I found others to work with and created a volunteer organization that seeks a research-based approach to addressing climate change locally. I became a master naturalist in 2014 and later completed the Maryland Climate Academy coursework. For the last 2 years, I've been researching wildlife corridors and have completed a white paper. Its cover is shown on the right, and I can send you a copy if you email me at my address below the picture, and that'll also be on the last slide. Currently, I'm working with the Catoctin Land Trust and other stakeholders, such as you possibly, to implement them not only in Frederick County, but statewide. First, I want to set the stage for this presentation with a philosophical foundation for the need for wildlife corridors. That nature is not valued in our financial and market systems. Climate change isn't the only thing threatening humanity. We need to address the loss of biodiversity. We'll see wildlife corridors as a way to mitigate the effects of both climate change and biodiversity loss. And I'll show that Frederick County is already in a place where already has in place a policy document that calls for wildlife corridors as a part of a green infrastructure plan for the county, and that we should advocate for it. So I'd like to begin with a statement from a 2021 United Nations report entitled Making Peace with Nature. The fact that a global enterprise like the UN found it worth its time and energy to produce this 168-page report helped me see that taking nature for granted is not unique to our culture. We've had long-held cultural and religious beliefs that to me go something like this. Nature and its benefits are all around us and will never go away. And no matter what we do, because nature will always be there. There will always be clean air, clean water, and no matter what pollution we produce, no matter how much forest we consume, and no matter how far we intrude into natural areas with development, the earth will sustain us. I remember going to a high school class reunion where I told a former classmate about my work with climate change, and his response was, "Oh, this old earth, it'll always take care of us." And as we're seeing and experiencing, that is not necessarily true. Humans need the earth to exist. However, the reverse doesn't appear to be the case. The natural world is our life support system. Nature provides the foundation for human existence and prosperity. Its essential value includes providing clean air, clean water, healthy soil, nutrient cycling, for example, when dead animals decompose and their nutrients are returned to the soil, and medicines for healing. For example, the key ingredient in aspirin is salicylic acid found in willow tree bark. But our economies are based on growth, And that growth is measured in the gross domestic product, which fails to adequately capture the costs of environmental degradation and reflect declines in natural capital, which is all of the things that keep us alive, our natural assets, including our geology, soil, air, water, and all living things. According to the scientists around the world who contributed to the United Nations report, climate change and biodiversity loss are equal threats to humanity and must be addressed together. So let's look at the effects of climate change and biodiversity loss. For many of you, this will be a review, but I find this explanation helpful so you can follow along. Climate change is caused by an enhanced greenhouse effect. The sun's rays pass through the atmosphere as light. However, they're reflected back as heat. And up until the Industrial Revolution, most of the heat escaped to outer space, which allowed Earth to cool. And the rest was trapped by carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases, keeping the Earth warm enough to sustain life, the greenhouse effect. But the burning of fossil fuels during the Industrial Revolution produced more greenhouse gases and increased the amount of heat retained in the atmosphere, which has enhanced the greenhouse effect and caused Earth's surface to heat up. This map is from the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science, indicating that by the summer of 2080, plants and animals now in Greenville, Mississippi, will be more adapted to our area, which will become 7.8 degrees warmer and 3.6% drier. Now let's look at global biodiversity loss. In 1950, the world's population was 2.5 billion. So think about it. Since year one, when calendars began, and continuing through 1950, about 2,000 years, up to 2.5 billion humans inhabited the planet. By 2100, the human population is projected to be 10 billion. For comparison, it took about 2,000 years for the world's population to reach 2.5 billion, and it will take a mere 150 for it to quadruple. So where did all of those people go? Excluding Antarctica, about 77% of Earth's land surface has been altered by human encroachment into natural areas. 20% of all species are in danger of extinction over the next few decades, which is tens to hundreds of times faster than the normal rate over the past 10 million years. There's a quote from a 2021 paper published in Frontiers in Conservation that goes as follows. The scale of the threats to the biosphere and all of its life forms, including humanity, is in fact so great that it is difficult to grasp, even for well-informed experts. Here is a New York Times map showing concentrations of imperiled biodiversity in the United States. Lower concentrations are in light colors, moving in intensity to reds, with the highest concentrations in dark red. So notice in the east where the Appalachian Corridor houses much threatened biodiversity. This map is produced by the Nature Conservancy and is called Migrations in Motion, and you can Google Migrations in Motion and see this map. It shows the average direction mammals, birds, and amphibians need to move to track hospitable climates as they shift across the landscape. As climate change alters habitats and disrupts ecosystems, where will animals move to survive? And will human development prevent them from getting there? Notice how heavily the Appalachian Corridor is traveled. It's the only corridor that looks like this in North America. The Appalachian Trail Conservancy formed a climate advisory group to envision the future of the Appalachian Trail, which is celebrating 100 years in existence. And the Conservancy worked with the Nature Conservancy and other stakeholders to produce a report last year entitled Conserving an Intact Landscape, Designing a Corridor in Response to Climate Change. On this map, you can see the trail and its viewshed in green, and around it, a gray outline, which is the contribution of the Nature Conservancy. And you notice the similarity of this gray outline to the Migrations in Motion map that you just saw. The Appalachians are a wildlife corridor, and Frederick County is a gateway to the Appalachians. In response to the impacts of climate change and biodiversity loss, plant and animal species will either adapt, shift north or to higher elevations, or die out. This map is from the Maryland Environmental Resources and Land Information Network online and is found on the Department of Natural Resources website. It's called Merlin Online. So this map labels the ecologically significant areas as significant, which is the lighter green, moving to moderately significant, then highly, extremely, and critically significant. But the Department of Natural Resources website is careful to state that even areas labeled as significant are worth protection. As you look at the map, note that the vertical blue and purple lines on the western side of the county are the Catoctin and South Mountain ranges and are the eastern edge of the Appalachian Corridor. So now we move to the corridors themselves. We'll look at wildlife corridors by definition, habitats, features, examples, laws, and policy framework. One definition of a wildlife corridor is an interconnected network of natural areas and other open spaces for both plants and animals that conserves natural ecosystem values and function, sustains clean air and water, and provides a wide array of benefits. They're also called conservation corridors, migration corridors, dispersal corridors, and environmental corridors. Types of habitats. There are three general types of habitats to be protected: aquatic, interior forest, and grassland. Aquatic habitat includes rivers, streams, wetlands, swamps, bogs, vernal ponds, vernal pools, and headwaters. And here are a few examples of animals in this habitat needing conservation efforts. The Maryland State Wildlife Action Plan states that freshwater mussels, amphibians, and fish were scored either extremely or highly vulnerable to climate change. And almost 40% of Maryland's globally rare plants are extremely vulnerable. Animals in forest interior habitat need the insulating effect of a large forest interior, free from human disturbance, to breed successfully and maintain viable populations. They include bobcats, birds, box turtles, and the Allegheny wood rat, which is commonly called the pat rat. Bats, frogs, salamanders are also included. This picture of a grassland habitat was taken from the Catoctin Mountain Range looking northeast. Grasslands came into being when farming began with Native American cultures. They were once plentiful, but have steadily declined. Virtually no grasslands are left, and species rely on temporary fallow farm fields. Grasslands are particularly important for birds. For example, the number of birds in the US and Canada has fallen by 29% since 1970. There are 2.9 billion fewer birds than there were 50 years ago. And here's kestrel, which is one of the species that is in need of conservation. I focused on these habitats and descriptions on animals, but plants will move too. An 18-year ongoing plant corridor study in South Carolina looked at 239 plant species with varied dispersal ability, and it included species of conservation and restoration concern. Plants disperse seeds in various ways, and their dispersal is an important corridor consideration. For example, wind direction is important for plants that disperse seeds in the wind. Other plants reproduce by sending out suckers, so that expansion, the need for a corridor expansion or for a corridor to accommodate expansion is important. This study found that habitat connectivity increased rates of colonization by 5% and decreased rates of extinction by 2% annually. After 18 years, almost 2 decades, there were 14% more species in connected fragments. Compounded over time, these small gains can generate large increases in species richness in fragments connected by corridors. And that was a conclusion of this study. A look at this diagram here, you can see how the study was conducted. This barbell-shaped area contained the corridors, 150-meter corridors for plants, 150-meter corridor for plants to migrate down. And the others were control unconnected wings. So in the bottom, you'll see how this looked on the ground in the beginning and at the end after 18 years. So let's look at wildlife corridor features and see some examples. We talk about wildlife corridors that connect fragmented habitat in terms of hubs, corridors, and transition zones. Hubs and corridors increase species range and allow for the freer movement of otherwise isolated populations. And this increasing range reduces problems associated with inbreeding. Hubs are large, intact landscapes of maybe 50 to 250 acres that include sensitive plant and animal species. It's better if they include water sources. Forest interior spaces need bigger hubs. Corridors connect hubs and should be as wide as possible. The longer the corridor, the wider it should be. One rule of thumb is to prioritize corridors along streams and waterways. Transition zones extend boundaries to mitigate effects of noise, light, animal intrusion, and other things that would disturb the processes that are going on in the corridors and in the hubs. Our landscape is so fragmented that sometimes species movement needs help, especially with an obstacle like a road. Here are some examples of corridor augmentation. In the top left, you'll see the inter-county connector that connects Route 270 with I-95. and includes bottomless arches to help wildlife navigate under the road. And the top right shows a wildlife overpass on the Trans-Canada Highway in Banff National Park in Canada. On the bottom left, there's a railroad track underpass for turtles. You can see the problems for turtles in the red circle. And in the lower right, red crabs climb over an overpass to cross a road on Christmas Island in Australia during their migration. The Maryland Sierra Club Natural Places Committee is mapping a wildlife corridor across the state. This group's vision is based on the work of wildlife ecologist and entomologist Doug Tallamy, a University of Delaware professor who advocates for a homegrown national park where private landowners connect vegetated areas on their properties to create wildlife corridors. The idea is expanding to other Maryland counties with a goal of eventually connecting to other corridors in surrounding states. In this map, you see the Patuxent Research Refuge connected to the C&O Canal National Park, which is also a wildlife corridor. But you'll note that the green shows a corridor and blue shows a gap. Frederick County corridors. Here is a corridor map for Frederick County produced by the Department of Natural Resources. Note the term green infrastructure in the upper right corner of the map. We'll come back to that. I want to draw your attention to the highlights on the insets. Inset A shows the northwestern part of the county with a patchwork of forest hubs and other forest areas that could provide a possible connection between the areas of Catoctin Mountain Park and Cunningham Falls State Park. And you'll note in this map, the Appalachian Trail is shown in purple. Inset B shows a narrow network of hub and other forest areas, including Gambrel State Park and Catoctin Creek, that could provide connection to the C&O Canal National Park and the Potomac River area. Let's move on to understand how wildlife corridor science is taking shape in the legislation and policy arena. On the national level, the following have not yet been signed into law. A House bill called the Wildlife Corridors Conservation Act passed the House in 2021, but failed in the Senate. A Senate bill, the Recovering America's Wildlife Act, was introduced in 2022 and would provide $1.4 billion annually for the restoration and funding of at-risk plant and animal species. It would pay, for example, to reconnect migration routes. Dr. Edward O. Wilson, who's featured in this photograph, was one of the most respected scientists in the world on the subject of biodiversity loss, and stated that this bill would provide the most important step of any single piece of legislation to protect. I'm sorry, I'm not being able to see what my notes say. Than any piece of legislation to protect areas. In terms of funding for wildlife corridors, a national executive order restoring America the Beautiful provides funds to protect 30% of America's lands and waters by 2030. And Maryland has passed the Maryland the Beautiful Conservation Act, which established and funded a state goal of protecting 30% of Maryland land by 2030. And this is all part of a global effort to restore 30% of Earth's land and oceans by 2030. On a state level, in 2020, Virginia passed legislation to create a wildlife corridor action plan that recommends crossing projects to promote driver safety and wildlife connectivity. This picture under the state is from the Virginia Department of Transportation. In 2021, Florida State Legislature unanimously passed a Wildlife Corridor Act that earmarked $300 million toward conservation easements. And Pennsylvania has just ordered a wildlife corridor study. I might mention that I've focused on the eastern states, but in the West, a major example is the Yellowstone to Yukon corridor, which is run by a network of nonprofit organizations, and it will connect the greater Yellowstone ecosystem to Canada's Yukon territory, a stretch of 2,100 miles. Anne Arundel County has just passed a green infrastructure plan that lists an objective to conserve habitat for plants and wildlife that includes a hub and corridor diagram. Frederick County's master plan calls for a green infrastructure plan, but it has not been created. A quote from the Livable Frederick Master Plan states, "Develop and implement a functional green infrastructure plan to protect, connect, and enhance the county's natural assets and support their role in ensuring future resiliency in the county." So what is green infrastructure? Green infrastructure is a strategic landscape approach to conserving ecosystems that supports environmental, social, and economic health. It protects the essential value of nature. The idea behind green infrastructure is ecosystem protection as a ground floor for preservation before making development decisions. This greenhouse map is included in the Frederick County Livable Frederick Master Plan and shows examples of wildlife corridors: South Mountain, the Catoctin Mountains, and the Potomac River. Livable Frederick includes wildlife corridor initiatives as follows: evaluate infrastructure projects to preserve contiguous habitat and connect fragmented habitats. Study methods to mitigate conflict between wildlife and motorists. Evaluate the need for wildlife and pedestrian crossings over roads. Create options and incentives for voluntary landowner participation in the establishment of greenways and trails. So what we need to do is finalize and enact the green infrastructure plan because there's competition for land use. Our population will grow by another 100,000 approximately by 2050, and we will need transportation, housing, services, and employment opportunities for these people. In terms of economic development, this county will be seeking to create workplace employment opportunities. And in agriculture is the largest economic driver in the county. And we need to allow space for parks and recreation. And finally, we need to balance all of these needs: population growth, economic development, agriculture, and parks and recreation, with protecting the natural world.
Does the data exist that quantifies the volume of wildlife road kills on highways, roads in Frederick County annually?
Good question. I don't know. I tried to find out at one point, and I learned that they weren't keeping track of roadkill on the side of the road, and I have not investigated it any further, but it seems to me that somebody should have an estimate. It's just going to take more effort to get some information.
Okay, next question. Do you know of any specific areas that need protection in Frederick County to maintain wildlife corridors?
Yes, I do, as a matter of fact. Brook trout are our only native trout, and there are just a couple of isolated populations, one in the Catoctin Mountains and one on Sugarloaf. And they are susceptible to the increasing temperatures of climate change, but one of the things that will mitigate that is groundwater. And so protecting groundwater in the Catoctin Mountains and on Sugarloaf by protecting the habitat can help to save brook trout. And I would direct you to the research of Dr. Nathaniel Hitt, that's spelled Hitt. He's with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service.
Oh.
And if you want more information or want to get in touch with him or see any of his publications, email me and I'll get you the information.
Okay, this question ties in a little bit to some previous ones. It says, it seems to me that corridors might be more susceptible to development and destruction in Frederick County, as at least some hubs are state and national parks. Is there any way to prioritize key corridors?
Yes, as a matter of fact, the Department of Natural Resources, I showed you that map. The Department of Natural Resources years ago, in 2003, maybe 2012, did a green infrastructure map that is currently being updated and should be available soon. And one of the things that they're putting in this new map are wildlife corridors, are conservation corridors. And that map that I showed you was provided to me by a member of the team who is putting that map together. And until I learn more, I don't know what the criteria are that they're using to designate the corridors, but this new map will show them.
Okay, right now we have no other questions. Does anybody want to unmute and ask anything?
Hey, Karen, everybody, thank you for your presentation, Karen. I can tell that you've put a great number of years and a lot of passion behind building that knowledge base. So I know we sort of mentioned the green infrastructure in Frederick County, and I can just say from my experience, following the Sugarloaf plan closely, that's sort of the first one out of the gate of 12 area plans. And I think it is the county's attempt to protect a very large piece to be, I guess, more of a hub than a corridor, but would allow for many other corridors to pass through.
Yes, the Sugarloaf plan has not been approved as of yet, but you're absolutely right, Justin.
Yeah, so it did make it through the planning commissions onto the county council, and what you said earlier is also true, that as citizens and patrons, or people that want to see these natural resources get protected, the government is our tool to do that. And I have seen them respond to public comment with alterations to their document. So I've seen it work. And I'm looking forward to them, stamping that plan into play.
And then I want to thank everybody for coming and joining us this evening, and wish you a good night.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, thanks.
Okay.
Great job, Karen.
Great
Thank
job.
you.
Thank you so much.